In this edition of Careers That Matter, I'm joined by Nick Bostrom of Oxford University, who is a philosopher, in many ways one of the leading thinkers in our understanding about where artificial intelligence can take us. Nick, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You have quite an interesting job. How do you describe what your job is?
Well, I mean, it sounds weird, but I guess it's really to think hard about big picture questions for humanity, and to try to do that carefully and to the best of my ability.
How do you go about doing that on a day-to-day basis? What does a day look like for you?
Well, I mean, there are different kinds of days. So some are more outgoing and involve like talking to people like you now. But on thinking days, I think it requires sustained periods of concentration, and it's hard to switch back and forth between the sort of outgoing communicative mode and the contemplation mode. So I will have different phases where maybe I go for many weeks or months in like basically just ruminating or trying to think about something, and then other phases of weeks or months where I do much less of that and more engaged with the world. And I find that kind of switching between these different phases helps avoid stagnation. But then you discuss with your colleagues, you try to write something up, get critiques on earlier versions, try to prove it. You read a whole bunch of what others have said. And you try to identify specific questions you feel confused about, and then think about them and trying to maybe break them down into smaller questions. You see if you can answer any of those, and you iterate, and it's a kind of an ongoing loop of activity.
When you're in that contemplative or thinking part of your job, you primarily do that alone, don't you? And I think about it in relationship to what Nikola Tesla once said about, ideas are. You don't need to have a lab. You don't need to have a room full of people discussing ideas. They actually come to you far more frequently when you're alone and quiet. And is that what is fundamentally important to you in the work that you do?
Yeah, so different people operate differently in that respect. Like others need social stimulation constantly. Others need solitude and quiet. I think mixing them and interleaving them kind of works best for me. So having different periods when you're more I do think that for most forms of creative work, being in a community or a group of other people who are also doing similar creative work to a high standard is important for actually producing stuff that is meaningful and relevant. It kind of keeps you on your toes. You share ideas, you absorb what other people are thinking and give back and get early critique of your thoughts. So being embedded in an intellectual community is for most sort of intellectual areas of activity, I think, essential. Philosophy is maybe a slight partial exception to that. I still think it's important in philosophy, but also some things of philosophy can benefit from temporarily removing yourself from the world and going really deep, which might require sort of degrees of isolation for periods of time.
So you're at Oxford University. Do you also teach? And I partly ask that because in Deep Utopia, you talk about this series of lectures over the course of a week. Do you actually do that kind of work as well?
No, I don't teach and I haven't in a long time. It's just a research position. Yeah, there is this fictionalized Professor Bostrom character in Deep Utopia, but he might bear some resemblance to the original, but he's also a fictional character in many respects, including the fact that he's forced to teach this lecture course.
So you have a job where you get to be a philosopher. How does somebody go about becoming you. So let's just talk a little bit about your career path. You grew up in Sweden. At what point did you start to realize that this is where you wanted to get to in your life?
Well, I hated school, and for that reason didn't really read or study or pay attention to literature or science or anything like that whilst I grew up. And I made a big kind of turnaround at age 15. By chance, I went into the local library one afternoon. I guess I had, nothing particular to do, and started pulling out a book here and there. And I realized that was a world of learning very different from what we were taught in school. That was much more fascinating, completely different, really. And at that point, I decided to embark on a kind of very intense program of self-education. I felt I had been wasting the first 15 years of my life. Then I started reading literature and studying science, and I painted and wrote poetry and did all kinds of things. Which then gradually led, I eventually went on to university, and I had this vague sense of these big picture questions being really important and neglected. And I didn't have a very specific idea of what precisely needed to be studied or done to think about these things, which is part of the reason why I studied so many different things, to try to pick up bits and pieces and insights from different academic disciplines. And then it kind of gradually came into focus more as I guess, progressed through graduate studies, etc. But now the world is interesting. And I think academia is not like, when I started out, academia was really the only place where you could realistically do this kind of work. I think now there is a much wider range of organizations that enable people to work full-time on, and particularly with AI. There's a lot of opportunities there to think about AI alignment and scalable methods for AI control, but some of these other things as well. So it's much less obvious now that the academic career would be the optimal path for people. I think it has a lot of this. It's extremely slow. Like, the bureaucracy can be soul-crushing, and it still makes sense for some people, I think. But I wouldn't want anybody to think that if you're interested in, like, I don't know, being a thinker or like stuff like that, you have to get an academic position or you're bust. Like, I think there are many alternative paths.
So for a young person who might be watching this right now going, I don't know, your life seems pretty interesting to me, what would you say to them is an extremely important personal characteristic that you have that has been fundamental to your ability to achieve the position that you have and the success that you're enjoying?
Well, I mean, largely, I'm fortunate that at this point in world history and in the places I happen to be, that was like actual support for doing this kind of stuff. I mean, if I had been born, I don't know, like a farmer in France in the 16th century or something, I mean, it's not really going to happen, right? And in most places around the world today, there just aren't any. So that's like number one. I would recommend people to be lucky. But then I think, like, if you happen to enjoy what you are doing, or to have a kind of intrinsic motivation for doing it, it makes it a lot easier to sustain a high level of effort over a long period of time and go beyond the natural point where most people would think, I've done enough, this is good enough, I can check that box, I can hand in my paper, I can, like, but to if you happen actually to enjoy it, and to me, it really, this whole dichotomy between work and leisure doesn't really make sense. I cannot really tell most of the time whether I'm working or just like having fun, because it blends into one another. That gives you a kind of an unfair advantage as well.
I agree.
Yeah, and then I would also say that for the specific kind of, like, thinking part of the work, like, to have some skepticism about the current consensus, and not be too eager just to absorb whatever the current orthodoxy happens to be, and a kind of then you will perhaps become successful in your career, but I don't think you will really make any actual real big contribution. You might not make that anyway, but at least you have to allow yourself a longer leash, and also to like think about like maybe to hold opposite views in your mind for a period of time without feeling an immediate need to take sides, and more slowly allow the kind of the ideas to evolve as they see fit on their own, rather than you trying to sort of direct them too much to a predetermined destination.
Well, I think that that's an important attribute to have in life in general, but especially, of course, if you want to be a philosopher. Thank you very much for giving us a glimpse into your world at work and the career path that has led you to where you are. Thank you.
Well, thank you.